Okay, hello everyone. Can we all see and hear me without any problems? Excellent. Okay, so um, just start out with a little bit of I don't know, a heads up. Um, it turns out that my scratchy throat from last time was not due to the wildfire smoke. I seem to be ill with some kind of, I don't know, upper respiratory infection. Um, So I'm going to be a little slower today because I'm feeling a little bit sick and tired. So apologies in advance. I'm going to try and do the best I can, given that I am really not feeling really not feeling too great today. So, oh, thanks, guys. Yeah, it's always a bit of a bummer when you're ill, um, especially in the summertime. I don't know. There's something about getting a cold or a flu in the summer. It hits different. Um, it hits different. I don't know. Maybe that's just me, but I dislike getting sick at any time. But in the winter, it's somehow more bearable for me, if that makes any sense. Yeah. Maybe it's because in the summer it's already hot and then when you're sick you get all bleh with a fever. Um anyway, we've got to finish off our discussion of behaviorism. And I think we left off around this slide. We were talking about the relationship between pain and behavior. Maybe I'll just go back one. Right, we were talking about how we fix our pain terms. And I believe I discussed this a little bit, talking about using, for example, this statement, the standard meter is 1 meter long, asking, following Kripke, whether this is a necessarily true statement. And we saw that it's not, right? The standard meter is 1 meter long is not a necessary fact. It's actually a contingent fact. Um, and that shows that we can use contingent facts to fix our concepts. And the same could be true of pain and pain behavior, right? So C5, recall, or rather, we will get into this next time, or this time we'll be talking about C fibers firing, identifying that with being in pain. Here we're talking about um, the relation between pain and pain behavior, which looks contingent. This is what Kim says on page 81. In a world in which different laws hold, or worlds in which the central nervous systems of humans and those of other organisms are hooked up differently to peripheral sensory surfaces and motor output systems, the patterns of causal relations involving pain may be very different. But as things stand in our world, pain is the cause of winces and groans, and certain other behaviors in humans and related animals. Now recall that what the logical behaviorist wanted was a sort of necessary connection between pain and pain behavior. Because remember, what the logical behaviorists want to do uh, is is be able to translate um, statements that use mentalistic terms into statements that use purely um, physical descriptions without a loss of content or a loss of meaning. Um, so here, um, given that it's a contingent fact that our nervous systems are the way they are, there's no logical entailment between, the say, winces and groans, making gestures of such and such kinds, and being in pain. So, um, it's a bit better if you're a behavior like a psychologist, a behaviorist psychologist, because you're just not interested in looking um, at the mental because it's unobservable. But if you're a logical behaviorist and you want to be able to translate these statements without a loss of meaning, this is going to be a problem for you. Were there any questions about this before we talk briefly about behaviorism in psychology? Okay, let's talk about behaviorism in psychology then. Um, so we've been looking predominantly at philosophical behaviorism. Um, there are a couple different ways we can think about behaviorism in psychology, though. One is normative, right? Normative or prescriptive. Whenever we're talking about normativity, we're talking about like an ought or a should. Um, so one way to conceive of behaviorism in psychology is as a sort of prescription for what psychology ought to be concerned with, right? Psychology ought to be concerned with understanding behavior, understanding stimulus and response, not with mental states. That's one way. The second way is radical behaviorism, where like what Watson and Skinner tried to do, which is to construct psychological theories that are grounded in conditioning. So if you're a radical behaviorist, you probably advocate a view that all learning is the product of conditioning. So, and conditioning is association and reinforcement. And as we discussed last time, we could be talking about classical conditioning, like Pavlov's dogs, or operant conditioning, like a rat in a Skinner box learning to push different buttons and so forth, right? We're not really going to be concerned with radical behaviorism here. In other classes, way back in the day when I used to teach Introduction to Cognitive Science, which I don't even think that course is called that anymore. But in any case, when I taught it, it was Intro to Cog Sci. We spent a bit of time talking about radical behaviorism and its downfall in that course. Um, we'll limit ourselves to the sort of normative characterization of behaviorism, and we'll call that, following Kim, methodological behaviorism. And here's a sort of claim that we can formulate that's very much in line with the methodological approach. And the claim is the only admissible evidence for the science of psychology is observable behavioral data. That is data concerning the observable physical behavior of organisms. Why should the behaviorist insist on this as their data? Well, I think last time we covered this pretty well, but recall the notion of intersubjective verifiability. Um, Even though intersubjective verifiability was also very much a sort of philosophical behaviorist idea, in that it comes out of logical positivism. I mean, think about it. And if you're a psychology student, like I know some of you are, you already know this. But we need our data if we're going to have an objective science. We need for our data to be publicly accessible. We don't want our data to be subjective, but intersubjective. Um, there's probably, there's a lot more wiggle room post cognitive revolution for this. Um, but if you're a behaviorist, why would you insist on this? Well, you want to have an objective science. What is publicly observable is the behavior, not the inner states, not the mental states. Although, we right at the very end of class on Monday, we did talk a bit about like the mental imagery debate briefly. So, the mental rotation studies of Shepard and Metzler are a really interesting example of how you can kind of mix it up and how you can actually get objective measures of inner states like reaction time for degrees of rotation when you're mentally comparing these two figures, right? That's why we insist on this. But there's a stronger way there's a stronger claim we can make, and that is psychological theories must not invoke the internal states of psychological subjects. So, where the first claim is just that observable behavioral data is the only data we're concerned with, this is stronger because it's calling for us not to invoke the internal states of psychological subjects. That is, psychological explanations must not appeal to internal states of organism, and that should be read as mental states as opposed to physiological states, right? Nor should references to such states occur in deriving predictions about behavior. Do we see why this is a stronger claim? Why two is a stronger claim than claim one? So, yeah, how could we even do this? I mean, well, B.F. Skinner, as I've said numerous times, thought that all learning was the product of conditioning. Different behaviors could be explained by different histories of association and reinforcement. And this is really the kind of the whole idea behind the behaviorist project, right? Um, if we can understand human psychology in terms of behavior, like completely in terms of behavior, and like understand how learning works in terms of conditioning, we could maybe even produce an ideal society where we could take anybody and train them to be a doctor, a professor, a firefighter, whatever. And we could make them like the best version of that simply by conditioning them the right way. And again, if you didn't look this up, or if you want to know what this looks like, I mean, just take a look at some of those early behaviorist experiments, like the little Albert experiment. But this leads Kim to ask on pages 84 and 85 if such an explanation works, right? If different behaviors can be explained by different histories of association and reinforcement, isn't that because the differences in the histories of the two organisms led to differences in their present internal states? Isn't it plausible to suppose that these differences here and now are what is directly implicated in the production of different behaviors now? So kind of like before when we were looking about the defeasibility of these physical mental entailments. Remember that from last time? There's always um, there's always another mental state that can come along, and there's always a potential defeater out there for these entailments, and it's always another mental state. So for the philosophical behaviorist, the issue is that you just can't escape invoking mentalistic terms. And it looks like um, something similar here, right? It's plausible to suppose that if there are differences in these histories um, between subject A and B, um, that's led to differences in their present internal states. So we can't really get away from invoking the internal states. Or plausibly, we can object and say, well, we might not be able to get away from invoking these internal states, right? Um, an even stronger claim: psychological theories must make no reference to inner mental states in formulating psychological explanations. Does that work? Maybe not. It's meant to rule out private or subjective states. That is, three is meant to rule these out. So maybe it leaves room for things like attention, memory, mental representations. Um, but I don't know. What do we make of this? I really like the way Kim addresses this. Other sciences, like physics, do posit unobservable entities, right? Think about quarks. What are quarks? Do we have any physicists in the room who can tell us about quarks? Yeah, they're very, very small particles, and they make up other subatomic particles. And there are different kinds of quarks, and they all have like very whimsical names, like strange quarks and charm quarks and up quarks and down quarks, right? And they make up protons and neutrons and stuff. But we can't directly observe these things. And if physicists can get away with this, why can't psychologists, right? I mean, look, uh, rhetorical questions are not arguments, okay? But consider that physicists do rely on so quarks are not just unobservable. They are arguably, like on some interpretations, they are just purely theoretical constructs that allow us to explain features of the natural world. Maybe mental states are like that too. In insofar as they're not publicly accessible, they're not directly observable, but also maybe they're even just theoretical. And that's fine. If it works for physicists, and physics is this, you know, super objective theory of everything, and we want psychology to be like physics, well, maybe we shouldn't shy away from making reference to inner mental states and formulating our explanations, right? Because if unobservable entities or theoretical constructs are okay for physics, why should they not be okay for psychology? So here's what Kim says about the third formulation of this claim. In excluding private conscious states from psychological theory, three excludes them from playing any causal explanatory role in relation to behavior. If this is true, as we ordinarily think, that some of our behavior is caused by inner mental states disallowed by three, our psychological theory is likely to be incomplete. There may well be behavior for which no theory meeting three can provide full explanations. And the reason is that these inner states might play a causal role in those behaviors, right? I think overall the picture I get from this book is that Kim is actually quite worried about epiphenomenalism, but and it looks like epiphenomenalism might be true, but we don't want it to be true. We want our mental states to have causal powers, and three disallows that. Um, so this chapter's probably seemed pretty negative toward the behaviorists, but that's not to say that behavior is not important, and that's kind of where we started, right? Um, After all, as Kim sort of reiterates at the end of the chapter, the brain is the base of the mind. Like ontologically, it's the base of the mind. If you don't have a brain, at least if you're a human being, if you don't have a brain, you don't have a mind. That's not to rule out, like as we'll look at later, the possibility of machine minds and stuff. But for human beings, the brain is the ontological basis of the mind. And the brain, and maybe also the mind, is the cause of behavior. And behavior, Kim says, is the semantic foundation of mental language, of like mind talk, right? Behavior fixes the meanings of our mental psychological expressions. This was the concern, the beetle in the box worry, right? Uh, I can understand um, that, like, I can know whether you're in pain by observing your behavior, but our sort of shared pain behaviors, even though these are contingent facts, these are what fix the meaning of our of mental and psychological expressions. Like Paul has a toothache, right? And behavior is also really like not just the first, but almost exclusively the evidence that we use to attribute mental states to other mental beings. So knowing other minds, and this is kind of again like how we escape the worry of solipsism, depends on observing behavior. It could be physical behavior, verbal behavior, etc. So behavior is important, even though behaviorist psychology, there's a reason why behaviorist psychology did not succeed. However, paying close attention to behavior is still super important if we are to understand, not just if we are to have a good psychology, a good science of the mind, but behavior is super important just for beings with minds to understand other beings with minds, right? Yeah. Yeah, good point, Holly. If you're going to be a radical behaviorist, you have to ignore so much beliefs, schemas, and much more. You have to discount the mental states that beliefs invoke lead to actions. Yeah, like the belief, desire, action principle. Remember what we were talking last time, right? You'd have to ignore all that. Um, It's kind of wild. I think I in my when I was doing my PhD. This is just a little anecdote to sort of go with your point there, Holly. When I was doing my PhD, we had our professor seminar, which was taught by Andy Brook from the philosophy department. So awesome, awesome professor. Learned a lot from Andy Brook. I continue to learn much from Andy Brook. And he kind of quipped one time about I think this point was due to Zen and Polition. Um, but like, if you're a behaviorist psychologist, you can ignore the mental as much as you want. But if you want to recruit people for your study, for your psychology study, you've got to put up a poster somewhere. Um, and you know, you've got to believe that other people will understand the poster advertising the study, that people will know how to get to the study, that people believe that they will receive, some kind of compensation for the study. Um, you have to, even if you're a behaviorist doing human research from a behaviorist perspective, there's still this implicit um, acknowledgement of there being mental states, and you kind of have to rely on this even to just get people to come into the lab so that you can get your work done, right? Um, I don't know. I always thought that was kind of interesting. All right. I guess we should talk about mind as the brain. Um, so this is when we get into the psychoneural identity theory. So we associate the mind with the brain. I think uh, our everyday, um, most of us nowadays are very comfortable associating the mind with the brain. Um, this is a lot different than ancient people who didn't really have a very good idea of what the brain did. You know, um, the ancient Egyptians, when they mummified their pharaohs, They didn't keep the brain. When the Egyptians mummified people, they would put their organs into these canoptic jars, right? Why did they do that? Well, it's because they believed that in the afterlife. Yeah, that's right, Joshua, to travel with them to the afterlife, right? And okay, let me preface this. I'm not an archaeologist. I'm not an Egyptologist. I'm not an expert in this, right? But I think it's an interesting little factoid, right? When the Egyptians were mummifying like a pharaoh, the idea was pharaoh would need all of his stuff in the afterlife. So they'd take out all the organs that they thought were important, the heart, the liver, the lungs, and keep them in these jars. They'd also have other things that the pharaoh would need in the afterlife. Um, you know, some of his possessions, right? But they didn't really know what the brain did, so they would just kind of go in through the nose and scramble it up and pull it out, get rid of it. Yeah, it's not clear. Like Lee, that's a really good point. Like when you're looking at the brain, like this brain here, it's not like looking at a heart, right? You can look at a heart and see like, okay, there are these chambers and valves and the blood flows through and okay, it must do this, right? It must pump something. The lungs, they're, full of these little chambers and they can expand and contract and okay, and we know they're here and when we take a breath, we feel that here in the chest. So, okay, it's pretty straightforward what lungs are for. They must be for breathing. The brain isn't like that. You look at the brain and you're like, huh, what is that there for? Like the Greeks didn't seem to really understand what the brain was for, although I think they probably had some notion of of like injuries to the head affecting people's behavior, personality, cognition. But if you look at somebody like Aristotle, Aristotle thought the brain was for cooling the body. That's what he thought it was for. Um, and thought and feeling in a lot of different cultures were not associated with the brain, or I guess the head, but rather with the heart or the gut. Really depends on the culture. But you know, thought and feeling, we know, I mean, feelings are a lot of the feelings occur in the body, but that's because that's how they're represented in the mind. And the brain is well, if you're an identity theorist, we can identify the brain and the mind as really one thing. Um, yeah, like a gut feeling, like a visceral feeling, right? Um, or even just your emotions. Like when we have these phrases like "follow your heart" or "so and so has a big heart," right? Um, it's important to note that these feelings are represented as being in those spots, but it's the brain that's doing that, right? Like if I tap you on the back of your hand, um, is that where the feeling is? No, right? This, what I'm seeing here, what I'm feeling, this is all mental representation. Um, so, um, we associate the mind with the brain now because it's starting in the 18th, 19th, and then going forward into the 20th century. We started to get a much better idea of um, of the importance of the brain. Yeah, like people would still associate emotions with the heart, even though emotions are like an embodied thing, though, right? But it's true. We do talk about it that way, right? Heart racing, your nauseous, anxious. Yeah, we feel these things in the body. Um, and it's true that. If your heart is racing and you're feeling nauseous, there are things going on in the body, but that's not where the feeling is, right? There is no location of the feeling. Um, that's kind of a category error if we suppose that. Um, but getting into the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, unfortunately, there were a lot of, well, there's always been a lot of conflicts around the world throughout history. Um, but in the 18th and getting more so into the 19th and 20th centuries, especially probably the biggest example, um, one of the biggest uh, what's a good word? Well, one of the things that, as unfortunate as it was, all of the death and destruction during the First World War, with trench warfare and bullets flying all over no man's land and whatever, is that when people came back with a brain injury from being, say, shot in the head, we were better able to associate where the injury was with particular losses of function. So we started to get a better idea over the years of not only the importance of the brain, but what different areas of the brain seem to be doing. Yeah, localization of function. And we'd look at things like double dissociations of function. So one area of the brain is damaged, which results in a loss of function A, but function B is preserved. Whereas when this other area is damaged, we still have function A, but function B is no longer there, right? So if you're a neuroscience student or maybe a psychology student, you might learn about like different kinds of aphasia, Broca's aphasia versus Wernicke's aphasia, right? Both have to do with speech, but both result from brain damage in different areas, Broca's area and Wernicke's area, right? Um, so over the past couple of centuries, a pretty clear picture has emerged between um, a picture has emerged of the relationship between the brain and the mind. And we know that changes in the brain seem to be correlated with changes in mental states. Yeah, you're right, Lee. Like with the advent of things like um, antibiotics, improvements of surgical techniques, right? I mean, eventually people realized that if you had a gangrenous limb, what you would need to do is amputate the limb, right? So that you wouldn't die. You would just come back an amputee. And eventually, with antibiotics, we realized we could treat infections with certain medicines, which allowed more people to survive, right? Also, people live longer. So you have more people reaching, this sort of more people getting older and having strokes, for example. And how can we forget about Phineas Gage? There's always Phineas Gage, right? Who knows about Phineas Gage? Of course, Holly, because you're a psych student, right? But who else knows? Yeah, the railway. Yeah, exactly. He was a foreman on the railway, and one day he was tamping down the I don't know what particular explosive material it was, but you would drill a hole and you'd put your dynamite or whatever in there, and you'd have to tamp it down with a tamping iron, which, like Paul says, is like a big rod. And basically, a spark ignited the explosives, and this thing shot up through his. I think it was his like orbitofrontal cortex or something. Anyway, he survived, but his personality was dramatically changed after the accident. So it was things like this that got people thinking, like, yeah, you know what, the brain, the mind, yeah, must be important. But it's not just brain injuries, right? Mind-altering drugs. We now know, um, uh, thanks to advances in medicine, that mind-altering drugs, their chemical structures are similar enough to endogenous neurotransmitters that we have in our brains that are there naturally. So these drugs are molecularly similar enough that they can either attach to some of those receptor sites or block some of the receptor sites, right? I've talked about this before. Like, why does coffee make you feel more awake? Well, caffeine interacts with your acetylcholine receptors in such a way that you don't feel sleepy, right? For example, um, anesthesia can block pain signals. So if you go for surgery, right? You'll probably be there are surgeries you can perform when you're awake, right? Uh, there are some surgeries where you'll be completely under. But either way, what's happening there is that the anesthetics that they're giving you are interfering with how the signals get to the brain. So you're not conscious of the pain. So we know that changes in the brain are correlated with these changes in the mental, but does that mean that your mind is just the brain? Ah, well, if you're an identity theorist, you would say something like that. That well, the brain just is the mind, or the mental just is the physical, right? Kim puts it like this: it's plausible that everything that occurs in mental life has a state of the brain or central nervous system as its proximate physical basis. So we get the mind brain correlation thesis, which is for each type M of mental event that occurs to an organism O, there exists a brain state of kind B, M's neural correlate or substrate, such that M occurs to O at time t if and only if B occurs to O at t. Let's try and make this a little more concrete, right? Because now we're dealing with these philosophical sort of definitions that can be a little abstract. And I don't want to get ahead of myself, but let's use, well, I guess I'm not getting ahead of myself because I say it right here, but let's pick a mental event like pain, the subjective experience of pain, the pain qualia, right? So I am organism O. And at time t, I don't know, I stub my toe. And so I have this mental state of pain. And that occurs only because at time t, my brain state of being in pain occurs, which could be my C fibers firing. C fibers are a kind of unmyelinated neuron that fire when we experience pain. So I only have my mental state at a particular time in a particular place because there's a corresponding brain state that co-occurs with the mental state. Everybody clear? Very good. These correlations, Kim says, are also law-like. So pain is experienced when my C fibers or my A delta fibers are activated, and that's a matter of lawful regularity. It's not a coincidence. When C fibers fire, there's pain, or when A delta fibers fire, there is pain. It's not just sometimes when I'm in pain, my C fibers are firing. No, they're law-like in the sense that if I'm in pain, my C fibers and or my A delta fibers are firing. And another thing about these correlations, even the smallest change in my mental life cannot occur unless there is some specific change in my brain state. If I have a headache, I take aspirin. and then my headache goes away. What happened there? Well, taking the aspirin caused a change in my brain state, which caused a change in my mental state, right? Now we're going to look at different kinds of correlation and try and compare them to the case of mind brain correlation. And I've quoted these all directly from Kim from pages 93 to 95. So, case number one. Whenever the ambient temperature falls below 20 degrees Fahrenheit and stays there for several days, the local lakes and ponds freeze over. Why? The answer, of course, is that the low temperature causes the water in the ponds to freeze. The two events are causally related, and this is why the observed correlation occurs. Pretty easy to understand, right? We observe a correlation between temperature and the state of matter in the pond, state of the water in the pond. When it's above 20, you can tell this is an American publication, right? Or you can think of whenever the temperature falls below 0 degrees Celsius, the water in the pond freezes. Why do we observe this correlation? Well, because they're causally related. If the temperature falls below the freezing point of water, that will cause the water to freeze. Very straightforward. Okay, now B. You enter a clock shop and find an astounding scene. Dozens and dozens of clocks of all shapes and sizes are busily ticking away, and they all show exactly the same time, 2 o'clock. A while later, you see all of them showing exactly 2:30, and so on. What explains the marvelous correlation among these clocks? Well, here, a common cause, the shopkeeper's action in the morning, explains the correlations that are now observed. To put it another way, one clock showing 3:30 and another showing the same time are collateral effects of a common cause. So here we have many different effects, all of the clocks reading the same time, as a result of one common cause, which is the clock, the shopkeeper adjusting the clocks so that they're all in sync with one another every morning. So one cause, many different effects. Another kind of correlation, this one a little bit different. We can imagine a slightly different explanation of why the clocks are keeping the same time. These clocks are actually not very accurate, and some of them gain or lose time markedly every 5 minutes or so. These sound like terrible clocks. Fortunately, there's this little leprechaun whose job it is to run around the shop, unseen by the customers, synchronizing the clocks every minute. This explanation involves the continued intervention of a causal agent. So it's a common cause like the first. But here, a single cause in B, where we had the single cause in the past, the clockmaker, here we have the continuing intervention of a common cause, which is the leprechaun. In both cases, there's this direct cause-effect relationship between the correlated events. Okay. So all examples of correlation so far, but somewhat different in terms of the causes of these correlations as we move from case to case. Now let's look at another one. Let's look at D. So, why do temperature and pressure co-vary for gases confined in a rigid container? The temperature and the pressure of a gas are both dependent on the motions of the molecules that compose the gas. The temperature is the average kinetic energy of the molecules, and the pressure is the momentum imparted to the walls of the container per unit area, right? So your pressure is, I don't know, so many pounds per square inch or something. Thus, the rise in temperature and the rise in pressure can be viewed as two aspects of one and the same underlying microprocess. So if the kinetic energy of the molecules increases, those molecules start moving faster, the temperature goes up and the pressure goes up. Again, one cause gives us two effects. These two effects are the result of the same underlying process. All right, now a different one. I know this is a little tedious, but bear with me. Now here's a different one. Why does lightning occur just when there is an electrical discharge between clouds or between clouds and the ground? Because lightning simply is an electric discharge involving clouds and the ground. There is here only one phenomenon, not two that are correlated with each other. And what we thought were distinct correlated phenomena turn out to be one and the same event under two different descriptions. Here, an apparent correlation turns out to be an identity. And we've used this example before, right? Uh, Electrical discharge doesn't cause lightning. Lightning is electrical discharge. And finally, why do the phases of the moon, like half, quarter, and so on, co-vary with the tidal actions of the ocean, spring tides, neap tides, and so on? Well, it's because the relative positions of the Earth, the Moon, and the Sun determine both the phases of the Moon and the combined strength of the gravitational forces of attraction exerted on the ocean water by the Moon and the Sun. So the changes in gravitational force are the proximate causes of tidal actions, and the relative positions of the three bodies can be thought of as their distal cause. The phases of the moon are merely collateral effects of the positions of the three bodies involved, and serve only as an indication of what the positions are, having no causal role whatever on tidal actions. So you might say, why are the tides stronger when it's a full moon or a new moon? Does the full moon or a new moon cause the tide? No. However, um, the causes are the relative positions of the Earth, Sun, and the Moon. And it just so happens that we get a new moon and a full moon when the moon is at these certain positions where the tides are going to be a little stronger, owing to the gravitational forces, um, of these three celestial bodies, right? Now let's look more specifically at different kinds of mind-brain correlations and try and link these back to the previous examples. So we've already looked quite a bit at dualism or like causal interactionism, the interactionist substance dualism of Rene Descartes. Here, the mental can affect the physical, and the physical can affect the mental. Okay, pretty straightforward. Can we relate these to one of our examples that we just looked at? Relate this one specifically to one of the examples we looked at? Maybe not, right? I mean, the idea is that it's a bidirectional causation. So this doesn't neatly fit in any of the previous examples, but um, you get the idea. I think all of the previous examples were good at illustrating lots of different types of causes, so we understand. I mean, we understand the interactionist substance dualists position pretty well, right? Um, One thing that we haven't really talked too much about is the notion of pre-established harmony. What do you think? Do we have any Leibniz people, any Leibniz fans in the course? Anyone who's read any Leibniz? Hmm, maybe not, huh? Oh, that's all right, Holly. Yeah, we don't have to go into super detail, but um, so Leibniz, where Descartes was a substance dualist, Leibniz was a substance monist. Leibniz thought there was only one kind of substance, and he thought this substance. Well, he thought that everything was composed of monads, which are I'm not really an expert on Leibniz myself. Um, but these little bits of substance called monads make everything up. So like my mind is a monad, my body is a monad or made of monads. But unlike Descartes, who thinks there is causal interaction between the mind and the body, so the mind, for Descartes, who's a dualist, you have your immaterial mind and your material body, and the body can affect the mind. So, changes in your nervous system can affect the pineal gland, which causes things, causes appearances in the mind, right? Sensations and so forth. And the mind can also affect the body. So, I can will my arm to go up and it goes up, right? Um, for Leibniz, there is no causation. It's all kind of an illusion. And it's really due to this pre-established harmony. So the Leibniz, or so the monads don't really interact with one another. It just appears that way because of a pre-established harmony. So let's bring it back to the example of billiard ball causation, right, that I talked about last time, right? Think about like the last time you played a game of pool. And maybe something like this happened where you took your cue stick and you use that to strike the cue ball, and that strikes the eight ball, which then rolls into the corner pocket, right? Just for example. If you believe in causation, well then your action, moving the cue stick in such a way, affected the cue ball in such a way that it struck the eight ball in such a way that it rolled into the corner pocket, right? A causes B, causes C, et cetera, et cetera. Leibniz would say there was no causation there at all. It's all just pre-established harmony. God set the universe up. Um, I mean, no, I would miss it too, Liam. I can't. Yeah, no, I'm terrible at pool. I'm only good at using it as an example for talking about causality. But yeah, like Leibniz would say, those balls didn't actually cause other balls to move. No, no, no. It was all pre-established harmony. God set the universe up that way, such that at this moment the cue I would move my hand in such a way, and the cue stick would move in such a way, and then immediately after that the cue ball would move in such a way, and then the eight ball would move in such a way. The stick isn't moving the cue ball, and the cue ball isn't moving the eight ball. It's all pre-established harmony. Kind of, it's interesting, right? Like it's a curious notion. But this might be like the clockmaker setting all the clocks right in the morning, right? Oh, good question. Well, Berkeley, or Barkley, I guess is how it's actually pronounced. Uh, I mean, I suppose they differ. I actually don't know. I'm probably the wrong person to ask about this. Because Barkley is an idealist, and yeah, everything is mental stuff. Um, I don't think he advocates the same sort of pre-established harmony idea. Um, I would check with. There's probably a better philosophy professor to answer this question, though. Professor Frankel or Professor Bruff from the philosophy department, I would they would have a much better answer than I can give you when it comes to this. Yeah, Paul, I think that's a fair characterization, right? Um, yeah, yeah. If thinking about it, mind you, it's been forever since I've read Berkeley or Leibniz, like forever. Probably not since grad school for Leibniz, and Berkeley undergrad. It's been a long time. Um, but yeah, Berkeley definitely a subjective idealist. So the only thing that exists is idea, is mental substance. Um, and but God is like the guarantor of all of that, right? Like so this cup isn't a physical object. It's an idea. But I can leave the room and come back and the cup will still exist because God is kind of perceiving everything all the time, right? Was he a pantheist? I guess. I don't know. I don't know. Again, I'm probably the wrong person to ask. Yeah, beyond this, just the notion of pre-established harmony as it applies to causation here. I'm no expert. I'm no expert in Leibniz, so I don't want to tell you something that's wrong. You know. Um. Oh, there's also occasionalism. So Malebranche was an occasionalist. Occasionalism means so like God intervenes to cause things. So, like, I think the example he uses, that Kim uses, is like, I intend to raise my arm, and so I raise my arm. But if you're an occasionalist like Malebranche, what's actually happening is you're not raising your arm. God intervenes and makes your arm go up. So, if the pre-established harmony example is like the shopkeeper setting all the clocks to the same time every morning, then occasionalism would be like the little leprechaun going around and making sure all of the clocks are working properly. There's double aspect theory or dual aspect theory, which might remind you of Spinoza. So, mind and body are just modes of the same substance. So, it's God or nature, right? Spinoza, I do know Spinoza was a pantheist, or sometimes he's characterized as a pantheist, sometimes as a panentheist. Very subtle difference, but panentheism is like God is everything, but God is like imminently present in everything. Um, so God or nature, if you're a sort of Spinoza style pantheist or panentheist. Um, so my mind and my body are like I'm a mode that has these two attributes, which are all part of the same substance. Maybe you could relate this one to the gas example, right? The pressure and the temperature are two features of the same underlying process. So if the pressure goes up, the temperature is going to go up. Um, yeah, okay, that's pretty straightforward. Epiphenomenalism, which we'll read about more in future. In fact, one of your supplementary readings is a lecture delivered by one of the OG epiphenomenalists, Thomas Henry Huxley. And I characterize this as follows, as I've done before. But on epiphenomenalism, mental states are all effect, no cause, right? So think about like the tides and the phases of the moon, right? The cause of the tides is a result of the relative positions of the Earth and the Sun and the Moon. Like if the Sun is here and the Earth and the Moon is here and the Earth is here, there's going to be some tides. Likewise, if the Sun is here and the Earth is here and the Moon is over here, you're going to have some tides. You're going to have a tidal bulge because of the gravity of the Moon pulling on the Earth and it's pulling on the oceans and stuff. Um, that will correspond. Like, if the sun is here and the earth is here and the moon is over here, then I'm going to have a full moon because the light from the sun is going to be illuminating the side of the earth, the side of the moon that's visible from the earth. But the full moon is not what causes the tides. The moon being full is kind of like an epiphenomenon when it comes to the tides, right? There's also emergentism. Um, Maybe correlations between the mental and the physical are just sort of brute facts. We don't want to countenance too many brute facts, but you can think about it like, there are, mental states like consciousness emerge from the complexity of these physical processes that are sort of simple and non-mental, but once these arrangements become complicated enough, that's where we get mental events, mental properties, and so forth, right? Sometimes it just struck me, I forgot to mention this. Sometimes this double aspect theory is also called neutral monism. I'm going back a bit to the Spinoza stuff, but William James also advocated a view like this, where the mental and the physical are just um, there's only one fundamental substance, but um, the mental and the physical are two different properties that substance has. That's another way to think of this. And then we talked about phenomenalism and emergentism. And then there's the psychoneural identity theory. The mind just is the brain, and that's what we're talking about today. Mental states are just kinds of physical states, namely brain states, on identity theory. One argument for this position comes from J.J.C. Smart, whose paper is our supplementary reading for this week. Um, It's the argument from simplicity. It makes our theorizing about the mental simpler to identify mental states with physical states. Here's what Smart said. Why do I wish to identify sensations with brain processes? Mainly because of Occam's razor. There does seem to be, so far as science is concerned, nothing in the world but increasingly complex arrangements of physical constituents. All except for one place, in consciousness. That is, for a full description of what is going on in a man, you would have to mention not only the physical processes in his tissues, glands, nervous system, and so forth, but also his states of consciousness, his visual, auditory, and tactual sensations, his aches and pains. That these should be correlated with brain processes does not help, for to say that they are correlated is to say that they are something over and above. So sensations, states of consciousness, do seem to be the one sort of thing left outside the physicalist picture. And for various reasons, I just cannot believe that this can be so. That everything be explicable in terms of physics, except the occurrence of sensations, seems to me, frankly, unbelievable. So what Smart is saying here is that our sort of descriptions of human beings, when it comes to everything about them, is physical, except when you get to the mental. But uh, that's just too complicated an ontology for Smart. I mean, science is so enormously successful, and science looks only at the physical. Remember, this should be fresh in your minds, given what we just talked about when it comes to behaviorism, right? The behaviorist psychologists wanted psychology to be an actual science, a real proper science, akin to the natural sciences like physics. So we have to look at what is publicly observable and what is objective, and that is behavior. This is a bit more ontological, right? For Smart, it's like what? The natural world is explainable in physical terms, the human body is explainable in physical terms, but then we have to start talking about the mental, like as if it's something over and above the physical. That's like an ontological extra, right? And that's why he invokes Occam's razor. Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, I get it. Like I guess I just thought of this that meme, I'm somewhat of a scientist myself. I'm somewhat of a physicalist myself. Um, am I a reductive physicalist? I don't know. I don't think so. Um, but smart, like the identity theory is reductive physicalism or type physicalism. Um, that might not be where I sit. I constantly question what I believe about the mind, which I think is fine. I think it's important to pick a position and stick to it, but also I think it's okay to admit when you don't know. And I think that the mental is just so darn complicated and confusing that I think it's okay to admit when you're uncertain. So anyway, yeah. Um, Okay. What is Occam's razor? There are a couple different formulations that Kim gives us. The first is entities must not be multiplied beyond necessity. And the second is what can be done with fewer assumptions should not be done with more. The first formulation is ontological, right? It says do not posit entities, which we should read as beings. That's why it's ontological. Do not posit entities or beings that don't do any explanatory work for you. Again, like the leprechaun in the clock shop, right? How best to explain why all these clocks are perfectly synchronized when I go and visit the clock store every day? I don't know what I'm doing where I'm visiting the clock store every day. I must be some kind of clock enthusiast. But I go to the clock store every day, apparently, in this example, and the clocks are always perfectly synchronized. So, what's the best explanation? One entity, the shopkeeper, who we know exists, syncs up all the clocks every morning, or a second entity, an invisible leprechaun, goes around and constantly resynchronizes the clocks. Well, probably the first one, right? Formulation number two is what we call the principle of parsimony, where you should use the fewest number of unwarranted assumptions as possible. Again, the assumption that a little leprechaun is secretly going around constantly reconfiguring the clocks is unwarranted. Why? Well, because there probably aren't leprechauns, right? What are some other examples that we could apply Occam's razor to? I like to apply Occam's razor when I am, for instance, and I don't do this. I used to before I was an academic. I don't do it anymore. But when you get into an argument with somebody about a conspiracy theory, conspiracy theories are epistemologically dubious for a number of reasons. Um, they do funny things with the burden of proof. They violate the principle of parsimony, and often they violate the ontological formulation of Occam's razor as well. Um, yeah, like you know what? It always goes back to the flat earthers, Yosef. Like, and I guess I rip on them quite a lot, but that's because they deserve it. Um, yeah. Sorry, someone's laughing at me. Yeah, Liam, as you should. Yeah, those damn flat earthers, they deserve every bit of what's coming to them. Um, So, uh, the flat Earth conspiracy theory is a good example because they believe that NASA, for example, NASA's not the only organization, but they believe that NASA is really withholding the truth from us. Um, to make that work, you've got to have a lot of unwarranted assumptions, and you probably also have to posit entities that are not doing much explanatory work. Secret agents, men in black, black helicopters, et cetera, right? But, right, yeah, like that's something. It's like conspiracy theories are like houses of cards, right? And we don't want knowledge to be precarious like that. It's actually better if it's straightforward and simple. And it's not just, this isn't just the reason why conspiracy theories are bad science. Um, this is the this also is sort of illustrative of why good science is simple. You want to use the fewest unwarranted assumptions as possible, right? Lee says, here's a weird example. If my rug is free of cat hair, even though my cat sheds a lot, it is because I vacuumed or because I used a pair of tweezers to pick off. Yeah, yeah, right? Like, that's the simplest explanation. Like, okay, we know there are vacuum cleaners and the people use them. Um, yeah. Yeah, oh yeah, from that flat Earth. That's from that flat Earth documentary, right? Where he gets a laser gyroscope and he's like, this gyroscope is $15,000 and it's got lasers and it's the best kind of gyroscope. And it shows a drift of the type you would expect if the Earth was round and rotating, and well, the gyroscope is broken. No, your theory is wrong. Like, I'm sorry. Actually, no, I'm not sorry. You deserve this, you flat earther. Yeah, yeah, Leo, exactly. You have to assume that every person on an airplane is in on it somehow. Yeah, yeah, Samantha. Although it's conceivable that there could be zebras, like imagine the zebras escape from the zoo. That would be weird. It's not out of the question, but you're still going to assume horses, right? Because what are the chances of the zebras escaping? Yeah, so, but it's not just like, look, I'm not just ripping on conspiracy theorists. We want real science to be parsimonious as well. Remember last time we talked about phlogiston and the luminiferous ether and the elan vital. These are entities that we don't need to explain, combustion or how light travels through a vacuum or why things are alive. These are entities that we invoked or assumptions we made, um, that are not necessary. So really, these are quite close. These are two different formulations that are one you can think of Occam's razor ontologically or like in the sense of assume making assumptions. But either way, you want as few entities or assumptions as possible. Ah, yes. Yes, Holly, great. Yeah, that's another great example. The Ptolemaic model versus the Copernican model of the solar system. Yeah, like I said in Philosophy of the Paranormal, when we talked about astrology, um, the Copernican model worked just as well as the Ptolemaic model. It didn't work any better because Copernicus didn't know that the planets went in ellipses. He thought they went in circles. But Copernicus's model won out because it was simpler. Like Ptolemy's model involved like weird crystal spheres and planets moving in circles within circles and stuff to explain retrograde motion, with the Earth at the center and the sun and the moon and the other planets going around the Earth. Copernicus said, well, why don't we just put the sun in the middle and the Earth and everything goes around the sun? And it worked just as well as Ptolemy's model and was much simpler. Of course, once Johannes Kepler and Tycho Brahe entered the picture, we realized planets move in ellipses, and then we really start to perfect that model. But Copernicus's model won not because it was better, because it was simpler, you know? Yeah, that's right, Joshua. Fake every piece of engineering and yep. Yeah. Yeah, this is good. Yeah, all of this. Yeah, this is why I say conspiracy theories are like houses of cards, you know. They're very precarious because they're not parsimonious. They do funny things with the burden of proof. They cherry pick evidence. They're like backward science. So the way science is supposed to work, conspiracy theories are the reverse of that. Boy, all this ripping on flat earthers has gotten me feeling a little bit better. Um, well, I think it's time. No, no, seriously, we shouldn't bully people, okay? Like, if you meet a conspiracy theorist, I think it is okay. I think you really should try to engage with them in good faith and not just make fun of them. But also those flat earthers. Oh, geez, it's silly. Anyway, I think it's time for a little break. Yes, Lee, that's another way of putting it. Scientists, because scientists are attempting to falsify their hypotheses. Conspiracy theorists are not. That's another good point. Very good. All right. Well, I don't want to get off topic, and I think I could use a little bit of a break. So let's come back at 5 minutes after 4. Yeah, I'm sorry. I really don't. I look. I'm making fun of the conspiracy theories, not the people that believe in them. I guess that's what I'm like. If you meet someone who believes something wrong, you should try and engage with them in good faith and try and lead them to the truth. Yeah, like the Christians say, Lee. Yeah, so try, don't make fun of the people, but try and be nice to them. Because a lot of people believe in conspiracy theories these days, and it's not good. I worry we become more insulated from one another by making fun of the people and not criticizing the belief. Anyway, let's come back at 5 minutes after 4. I'll see you all shortly. All right, let's get going again. I'm just going to go back one slide, or two slides, just to recall that one reason to identify sensations with brain processes is because it's simpler. It simplifies our ontology, and uh, it also seems to simplify our talk about the mental as well. So it's conducive, as Kim says, to linguistic and logical simplicity too. Finally, and Kim writes, this is what SMART seems to have in mind. Suppose we stop short of identifying pain with C fiber stimulation and stick with the correlation. It's correlation as opposed to identity. Pain occurs if and only if C fiber stimulation occurs. Well, we still have to explain the correlation. And in science, how we explain correlation is by deriving uh, laws that explain correlations from more fundamental laws and correlations. Now, are there more fundamental correlations from which we could derive pain occurs if and only if C fiber stimulation occurs? What do you think? While you're thinking, I just have to let my dog in. Well, so let's keep in mind that this is what's going on. We've got this correlation, and Smart seems to be arguing that um, by identifying uh, physical states with brain states, that we're simplifying things. So the question is whether this works the way that explaining correlations in other areas of science works, right? That's the claim, right, Liam? Like that they're one and the same. Like pain just is. Why so the idea seems to be like why is pain correlated with C fiber stimulation? Because it's not a correlation, it's because pain is C fiber stimulation. But is that the way we explain things in the sciences? Not really, right? How we explain things in the sciences is by deriving laws and correlations from simpler laws and correlations, right? So the question is, can we do something similar here? Yeah, yeah, Leo. Basically, it would get really messy. And that's where Kim kind of takes the discussion, right? Like, okay, pain is C fiber stimulation. Okay. Then what is, I don't know, pleasure? Maybe it's, I don't know, endorphin release, right? And we'd have to have one law specifying one law of identity for each mental slash neural correlation, right? And that gets very bloated, as Kim says. Actually, Kim writes, compare this bloated picture with what we get if we move from psychoneural correlations to psychoneural identities. Pain occurs if and only if C fiber stimulation occurs, just becomes pain is C fiber stimulation. Pain and C fiber stimulation are one and not two. And we are not faced by two distinct phenomena whose correlation needs to be explained. In this way, psychoneural identities permit us to transcend and renounce these would-be correlation laws, what Herbert Feigl aptly called nomological danglers. So nomological from nomos, which just means like law or order. So rather than having to specify lots and lots of different laws to explain lots and lots of different psychoneural correlations, we can just identify the mental with the physical. Now, here's something to think about. Does this approach, the psychoneural identity theory approach, is what's happening when we apply this approach? Aren't we merely replacing the correlations with an equal number of identities, one for one? I mean, if we're trying to follow smart and make things simpler, um, what we're really doing, if we're taking smart side, is we're appealing to the simplicity of the identity statements over correlations. But there are just as many identity statements here, are there not? Okay, Paul asks, even though lightning is atmospheric electrical discharge, physics still explains why we see it as visible light. If pain is C fiber stimulation, then don't we need an explanation for our experience? Uh, well, the answer is going to depend on who you ask, right? I mean, smart. Did anybody actually this is a good a good point to ask whether you read Smart's paper? Because the example that Smart uses is like a yellowish after image, right? That's his example. I think it's just interesting to say that uh, we're having like to say I'm having a yellow after image is just to say I'm having like a mental event of a certain kind. Um, so I don't know like why I see it as visible light. I guess I'm not sure, Paul, if you're talking specifically like if I have an experience for pain, then I'm just having C fiber stimulation is what an identity theorist would say. Um, okay, Holly says I had trouble with this because the fibers can exist without pain. Pain is like a code that is spoken in binary. It's an electrochemical process of on-offs. It's a code. Pleasure is another code. Sure, certain networks pick on the code, but then there is a receiver. A language needs a receiver. Yeah. Um, yeah. I mean, you see why this is complicated, right? Um, let's try and make it not get super complicated. Yeah, yeah. Missing the explanation part of the explanation. Yeah. If I understand what you're saying, yeah, I think I'm somewhat sympathetic to what you're saying, Paul. Um, for now, though, I don't want to get ahead of myself. Uh, the question is for now whether, in appealing to the simplicity of identity statements, we are really actually simplifying things, right? Um, I suppose it's fair to say that advocates of this kind of identity say that uh, this can help us to explain certain things that we would otherwise not be able to explain. There are good explanations, like psychoneural identities are good explanations, and that's a good enough reason for us to accept mind-brain identity theory. So if that's the move being made, then what's happening is that these people are appealing to the principle of inference to the best explanation, right? And this is the way Kim puts that principle. If hypothesis H gives the best explanation of a phenomena in a given domain when compared with other rival hypotheses, H1, H2, etc., we may accept H as true, or at least we should prefer H over the other hypotheses. So the idea here is that identity statements like pain is C fiber stimulation is a better explanation than rival theories, such as dualism. That's the idea, right? And keep this in mind because this is important for Kim's analysis here. Um, now, according to Kim, explanatory argument one, we're going to take a look at two versions of an argument for psychoneural identity theory based on inference to the best explanation. The first one takes the explanandum, what is to be explained, to be psychoneural correlations, claiming that psychoneural identities give the best explanation of psychoneural correlations. So the claim is that we've got these psychoneural identities, right? Like pain is C fiber stimulation, or maybe something like consciousness is pyramidal cell activity, or whatever claim you want. Explain the corresponding correlations. So pain occurs if C fiber stimulation occurs, is explained because pain just is C fiber stimulation, right? Same with, talk about lightning again, right? Like lightning occurs whenever there is an electrical discharge in the atmosphere because lightning just is electrical discharge, right? The argument here, at least on explanatory one, and keep in mind, we're appealing to the principle of best explanation or inference. Appeal to the best explanation, and our explanandum are the psychoneural correlations. Consider analogy, though, or several analogies. Clark Kent turns up wherever Superman turns up. How do we explain that? Well, because Clark Kent is Superman, right? You're out there with Clark Kent, and something happens, some kind of comic book supervillainry. All of a sudden, oh, hey, where'd Clark Kent go? I don't know. Oh, but there's Superman saving the day, right? Best explanation is just that Clark Kent is Superman. Similarly with Bruce Wayne, right? It's like, hey, Bruce Wayne doing some kind of Bruce Wayne sort of thing, and then all of a sudden, where's Bruce Wayne? That's the like. There's a scene from The Dark Knight, which is exactly like this, right? Where Bruce Wayne's got a party, and all of a sudden he runs. The Joker comes in, right, and Bruce Wayne goes to the safe room, and everybody's like, "Where's Bruce Wayne going?" And then all of a sudden, Batman is there. Well, the best explanation is that Bruce Wayne is Batman, right? Lots of other examples. Walter White creates the same crystal meth that Heisenberg does because Walter White is Heisenberg, right? So on the first explanatory argument, at least when we're talking about pain, we have something like this. Pain just is C fiber stimulation, therefore pain occurs if C fiber stimulation occurs. That explains the correlation. And the correlation is what we want to explain, and we're doing it this way because it's simpler. It's the better explanation. We should prefer an explanation like this over something like, say, dualism. And when it comes to other kinds of mental states, for every mental property M, there is a physical property P such that M equals P. So for every mental property, there's a physical property that occurs. There's a physical property such that whenever that mental state or mental property occurs, it's because P has occurred. The mental state occurs if and only if P occurs. So, appealing to the best explanation. If A is a good explanation or the best explanation, wonderful. But if A is not a good explanation, then B cannot be a good explanation. So if this is not good, this won't work. If this is not a good explanation of psychoneural correlations, then B will not be a good explanation of psychoneural correlations. And it turns out that A might not even be an explanation at all. Now, this is one of those chapters where I think I don't want to put it like Kim has an agenda or something. But a lot of what goes on in this chapter is Kim just kind of really trying to show us that identity theory doesn't work. I think you really get a sense of that in this chapter as you read through this chapter. Here's what he says on page 104. If pain indeed is identical with C fiber stimulation, in what sense do they correlate with each other? For there is only one thing, whether you call it pain or C fiber stimulation, and as Smart says in the paragraph quoted earlier, you cannot correlate something with itself, right? Superman isn't correlated with Clark Kent. He is Clark Kent. For Smart, the very point of moving to the identity statement, pain equals C fiber stimulation, is to transcend and cancel the correlation pain occurs if and only if C fiber stimulation occurs. This is the nomological dangler to be eliminated. And furthermore, by opting for the identity, we show that these questions have no answers. Since the presupposition of the questions, namely that pain correlates with C fiber stimulation, is false. The question then, why is the case that P presupposes that P is true? When P is false, the question has no correct answer, and it cancels itself as an explanandum. So, we want to explain this correlation, and we explain the correlation by saying, by identifying, C fiber stimulation with pain. But that's not a correlation if we're saying that C fiber stimulation is identical to being in pain. It's an identity statement. What if we're just getting hung up on the semantics, though, right? Maybe we could just say that correlation in this particular context means identity. But then we have questions like, why is it that pain, rather than some other sensation, is correlated with C fibers firing? Identity theory doesn't help us, doesn't dispense with these questions, right? We still have this problem. Okay, pain is C fibers firing. Why? Why? Why does pain feel the way it does? And importantly, statements like pain equals C fiber stimulation are sort of trivial, right? I mean, these are like tautologies. So I don't know. What do you think? Any problems with identity theory so far concerning whether it is actually a simpler explanation? Keep in mind also that at least insofar as how Kim has framed this, this argument is invoking the principle of inference to the best explanation, right? This is a rule of induction, like a rule of thumb. We should opt for the best explanation, but it's not always this straightforward, right? In the sciences when we're trying to explain a correlation. No, that's okay, Holly. Yeah, well, that's a good point. And the argument that the final argument that we're going to look at against identity theory, which is the multiple realizability argument, right? That gets us to token physicalism rather than type physicalism. So, like when you say plasticity, it's like, yeah, we don't all have the same type of brain state, right? Um, yeah, I agree. And also, I admit I have some like I like this book. I do think that it's a little bit more technical than it needs to be in certain areas. Like Kim has a very Kim does this in the way that he does it, which is a good way to do it. But it's not the most straightforward, easily digestible way of learning about identity theory. So how do we explain correlations in the sciences? Well, remember earlier we said that one way to explain a correlation is to deduce it from more fundamental correlations or more fundamental laws. What are some examples? Well, just in general, you know, scientific theories are built out of laws. They explain laws, right? Um, and they use laws to explain more complicated phenomena, like the theory of evolution, for example, um, works because Darwin identified a law, the law of natural selection, right? That's not really an example to do with correlation, but it gives you an idea. What are some examples of correlations that we deduce from more fundamental correlations in laws? Maybe think about the gas pressure and temperature example, right? I remember in an undergraduate science course I learned about the gas law specifically, which I don't recall now, but it explains the correlation between mean kinetic energy, temperature, and pressure, all in one nice, neat little package, right? Force equals mass times acceleration. Yeah, well, that's one of Newton's, right? But that's a good one. But what is one that explains? Okay, Boyle's law. What's Boyle's law, Paul? Oh, that's the gas law, Samantha. Is that the one I was talking about? Yeah, I've forgotten the formula for the gas law, but so the gas law, the ideal gas law is Boyle's law. Well, yeah, Holly, that's kind of what we're looking for, right? Like we see a correlation, we want to explain it. So we need to appeal to more a more fundamental law because the law tells us what's doing the causation, right? Hmm. Well, that's good. That's actually an example of the second one, right? Like um, a common cause. So there are two correlated phenomena, ice cream sales and murder rates, which I get, wow, interesting if true. Um, and the common cause is heat. I guess people get more murdery when it's hot. I don't know. Is that true? Like, wow, interesting. I learned something today. Scientists also don't just stop when they find what seems like the best explanation. They keep going. They form some predictions and they test those, right? Um, okay. Uh, how so? I'm just not. Which way does that apply, Liam? For the first point, like where we see a correlation and we deduce it from more fundamental correlations, or I'm just like how which is that meant to be an example of? I guess is what I'm asking. Oh, I see. Yeah. Then yeah, I see what you're saying, right? We maybe we Newton came up with that, but then and we used it because it worked, but eventually somebody came up with something better, right? Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I see. Predator prey correlations, population sizes cycle depending on the supply of food. Yeah, that would be like correlated phenomena that depend on common cause, which is the maybe the source of food, I suppose. Um, yeah. Okay, so just so we don't get hung up on generating all these examples, yeah, scientists don't stop when they find what seems like the best explanation. They formulate new hypotheses, they that make new predictions, and then they test those. They keep going, right? No, 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 no. It's good. It's good. Don't apologize. I just want to make sure I get through everything today. Um, so, what Kim says here on page 106 is interesting. The principle of inference to the best explanation gains credibility from its use in scientific hypothesis testing. That's why we appeal to it, because of what it actually does for us in science. Using it to support what is an essentially philosophical claim with no predictive implications of its own, and hence no possibility of further test, seems at best a misapplication of the principle. It can mislead us into thinking that the choice of a position on the mind-body problem is like quotidian testing of a rival scientific hypotheses, right? So what this boils down to, what Kim is saying here, is that if we're using inference to the best explanation to decide on a philosophical position, we might be using the wrong tool for the job, right? Because the inference to the best explanation, well, the best explanation is one or another scientific hypothesis, not a philosophical position. You see? You see what Kim is doing there? Let's look at explanatory argument two. This says that mind-brain identities enable us to explain certain facts about mentality that would otherwise remain unexplained. For example, how does pain cause a feeling of distress? Yeah, like how do you how do you test a philosophical identity statement? Um, but also, when the reason why just to go back to what Kim says on the previous slide, the principle of inference to the best explanation is a credible principle because of its success in science. Smart is not doing science. Smart is doing philosophy, right? So wrong tool for the job, perhaps. Okay. Explanatory argument two. Mind-brain identities enabled us to explain certain facts about mentality that would otherwise go unexplained. So, like, how does pain cause a feeling of distress? Well, let's say that pain equals C fiber stimulation, and distress is neural state N. So we have a neural state N that is distress. These are both identity statements. Now we can formulate a neurophysiological explanation for why pain causes distress. So we have our neurophysiological law here. C fiber stimulation causes neural state N, distress. Pain equals C fiber stimulation, distress is neural state N, therefore pain causes distress. Okay. Now, what if instead of identities, we use correlation? So instead of what we get here, we get something like this. C fiber stimulation causes neural state N. Pain occurs, that's correlation number one. Pain occurs if and only if C fiber stimulation occurs. Correlation two, distress occurs if and only if neural state N occurs. Therefore, pain correlates with a phenomenon that causes a phenomenon with which distress correlates. What a mouthful, huh? Does this really explain anything? Remember, the correlations are what we want to explain. And if you're an identity theorist, it's the identities that do that explanatory work. So we should accept this, but not this, right? As Kim says here on page 110, these identities enable desirable psychological explanations while disabling the improper demands for explanation of psychoneural correlations. But Kim is not convinced. He says further, the trouble is that in both arguments, the identities in question do not do or do not seem to do any explanatory work and are hence not qualified to benefit from the principle of inference to the best explanation. Rather, they just redescribe facts. So what's going on here and here are just redescriptions of facts. I'm not explaining anything by saying that pain is C fiber stimulation and distress is neural state M. I'm not explaining anything by saying that, for example, here, pain occurs if and only if C fiber stimulation occurs, distress occurs if and only if neural state N occurs. Therefore, pain is correlated with a phenomenon that causes a phenomenon with which distress correlates. I'm not explaining anything. I'm just re-describing something I already know or assume. Look, I'm really starting to lose people here. We're down to 13 people. Uh, pain isn't which one are you referring to? pain causes distress. This is the one that claims pain causes distress. So we have pain, identity statement, pain equals C fiber stimulation, and distress is neural state N. So these are identity statements. So when we say that C fiber stimulation causes neural state N, what we're saying is that pain, yeah, we're identifying. So if the law is C fiber stimulation causes neural state N, then what we're doing is identifying pain with C fiber stimulation and distress with neural state N, which allows us to re-describe this as follows. Pain causes distress. That's what this one says. And this one says C fiber stimulation causes neural state N, but it does this in terms of correlation. Correlation statements rather than identity statements. Yeah. Yeah, Liam, yeah, I get that. Just wait till we get to just wait till we get to causal theoretical functionalism. Wait till we get to that chapter. You're going to be like, well, depending on how much you like logic, you might be like, yes, or oh my God, depending on what you think of doing logic. I'm more of a natural language guy or an ordinary language guy. That ordinary language guy. I'm really more of an ordinary language person, not a formal logic person. Uh, but yeah, you'll see what I mean. If you take a peek at that chapter, you'll be like, holy moly. There's logic for days in that chapter. Yeah, we'll see. And also in the chapter on machine functionalism too, although it's like very like Turing machine sort of stuff, which I like. Turing machines are nice. Turing, even though they're imaginary, I find them to be very concrete. One of the most concrete imaginary things I've encountered in my academic career. So, okay, but you see Kim's concern, right? In these cases, what we're getting is not an explanation, but a redescription of facts in terms of identity statements and in terms of correlations. Yeah, I wonder if you could describe it that way, Paul. Like, so it explains it better because identity doesn't need to be explained. But but Kim's answer is that no, it does, and you're not explaining it, right? Or at least that's part of Kim's problem with this, I think. They don't explain, they redescribe facts, right? So those are the explanatory arguments. Right? Yeah. So Paul says, I still feel like more explanation is needed. That's why Kim thinks these arguments fail, because if they're supposed to be like making this inference to the best explanation, well, they're not good explanations. So no, right? That's what Kim is doing here. He's like, well, if you're saying, Smart, that what you're doing here is appealing to the best explanation, well, you need a better explanation, because this ain't an explanation. It's a redescription of facts. Let's take a look at the argument for mental causation now. So what do we mean by mental causation? We mean that mental processes are affected by physical processes, but can also affect physical processes, right? Like the Cartesian interactionist substance dualism. We don't want to be dualists necessarily, but we want an explanation of the causal interaction between the mental and the physical. So do something like this. Imagine you got a paper cut. So, ouch, it hurts. Paper cuts hurt. So try and trace the causal chain backwards and see where the mental and physical are actually causally affecting one another. So you cut your hand, you go, ouch. You feel pain, right? There's changes in the nervous system. So you get a cut, the skin is broken, signals travel through your nervous system. Those C fibers start firing. You go, ouch, and you jerk your hand back, right? Kim says the chances that the causal chain culminating in your hand's jerky movement when traced backwards will completely bypass your pain. Um, there will be more and more neural physical events as you keep going back, but no mental experiences. You know, you could do this at and as fine a granularity as you want to, but most, if not all, of this causal chain is going to be uh, neurophysical and not mental. That's what this is meant to illustrate. You see what Kim is doing here? Let's really try and break this down. What happens when you cut yourself on a piece of paper? What happens when you get a paper cut? I need some participation here. Good one. But really though, so signals. Well, that's an action you might take, but I mean like in terms of what's happening in the psychoneural stuff in your nervous system, right? So the skin is broken, nerve signals start traveling down the nervous system into the brain, and that might cause other nervous signals to make you go ouch, to withdraw your hand from the painful stimulus, maybe to look at what you've done, right? It's possible to do this and leave the mental completely out in terms of its causal role, right? That's a worry. Yeah, yeah, nerves from hand to the brain, brain brains. I like that. The brain brains, you say blorp. Okay, here's a bit of a more systematic version, right? That Kim sketches out for us. Premise one: mental phenomena have effects in the physical world. Okay. Um, But premise two is the causal close. This is a principle called the causal closure of the physical. The physical world is causally closed. That is, if any physical event is caused, it has a sufficient physical cause and a wholly physical causal explanation. Therefore, mental phenomena are physical phenomena. Let's try and break this down. Do we accept premise one? Mental phenomena have effects in the physical world. Like your sensation of pain causes you to withdraw your hand from the painful stimulus. Okay. Now, premise two, the causal closure of the physical. The physical world is causally closed. So if any event is caused, it has a sufficient physical cause. It doesn't have a necessary physical cause. That's a little bit different. That's determinism. That's causal determinism. It just means that um, for for any physical cause or for any physical effect, you never need to look outside of the physical to explain what for a cause for that effect. So in the example of tracing the causal chain backwards, from getting a paper cut, um, you don't need to look outside of the physical, to any Cartesian immaterial substance to explain anything that's happening there, like your sensation of pain, your willing yourself away from the painful stimulus, etc. Right? Otherwise, I think it's at this point that Kim says that if this weren't the case, this would basically just be telekinesis. like the mental affecting the physical in some kind of extrasensory motor way, and we know that that's not a thing. Um, so if you accept that mental phenomena can have effects in the physical world, and you also accept that the physical world is causally closed, then you've got to conclude that mental phenomena are physical phenomena. And so that's how you identify the mind with the brain. The mental phenomena are physical phenomena. It follows from these two premises that mental phenomena are physical phenomena. Kim elaborates more on this conclusion here. Mental events that have effects in the physical domain are physical events. The pain that causes your hand to pull back in a jerky motion and makes you cry, ouch, is a physical event. But which physical event? What better candidate is there than the brain state that is the neural correlate of pain, namely C fiber stimulation? C fiber stimulation is a necessary and sufficient condition for the occurrence of pain, and it occurs at the exactly the same time as the pain. So now we have a choice. We can be identity theorists and say, like, we can buy this argument. Okay, mental phenomena have effects in the physical world. The physical world is causally closed. Therefore, mental phenomena are physical phenomena. That's the argument for identity theory. Or we can be epiphenomenalists. It's all, mental phenomena are not physical phenomena, but they have no causal power. Because you could explain everything, from getting the paper cut to going ouch and doing this without the mental having any causal role whatsoever. Because the mental on epiphenomena is all effect, no cause. Okay, so Leo, you'd be an epiphenomenalist. So yeah, and then yeah, in that case, like you say, you would just deny the first premise. You would, if you're an epiphenomenalist, you would say mental phenomena cannot have effects in the physical world. So they must be something else. They must be like distinct properties from the physical, but perhaps with no causal power. What does everybody else think? Do we have any other epiphenomenalists in the room? No judgment. No judgment if you are. Um, Again, am I an epiphenomenalist? Sometimes I think I might be. But then there's this worry, right? Like, if epiphenomenalism is true and my mental states have no causal power, then what even am I? Am I not an agent? Right? We think of ourselves as agents, right? We are the sort of beings who act on the basis of reasons, and that's why, for example, we can be held responsible for our actions, like morally or legally. But if epiphenomenalism is true, what does that mean for us? It's a big worry, and I think Kim shares this worry. As we'll see in later chapters, right? Uh, Joshua says, I think I agree with both, since there seems to be what I consider to be sufficient evidence to support that mental states do affect the physical. Uh, wait. So, what? Wait a minute. You support both, like, an epiphenomenalist and an identity theorist? In any case, Paul says, oh, both statements. Okay. Oh, you mean these premises right here. Yeah, okay. Oh, yeah, yeah. So yeah, you'd be an identity. I thought you were saying I thought you were saying you agreed with identity theory and epiphenomenalism, and I was like, wait a minute. I don't think that works. But I misunderstood. So sorry about that. Um, Paul leans toward identity theory because, to me, he says it seems wrong that everything is physical except mental stuff. Yeah, but then what do we mean by the word stuff, right? If we're talking different substances, then sure, but not all dualism is substance dualism, right? We do have property dualism now, so that's a possibility. Um, yeah, no problem, Samantha. Like, if you're not sure, yeah, I'm not saying like decide right now if you're an identity theorist. No, no, no. Think about it. Definitely think. I don't know. What am I? I don't know. I kind of feel like I'm an epiphenomenalist, but I don't like what that means for me as a being. Uh, so yeah, definitely think about it. Holly says top-down commands come from bottom-up information. I'm trying to work this out. I thought I had it worked out yesterday, but it is elusive. What or who is in charge of the output? Is it just statistical modeling and no agency? My mind is blarbing right now, but I think I'm a property dualist. That's fair. I mean, another thing is like, yeah, I think the what or who is in charge, it may be another category mistake, right? Like maybe the mind or the person or the self or whatever, it just isn't like that. It seems to me that I am an I, but I'm not, right? Leo says, I wrote on this a bit in my reflection, but basically, I don't think a lack of free will or causal influence takes away from the value of conscious experience. We still feel all the things that happen to us, and there's value in that. Yeah, that's true. It's kind of like even if we don't have free will, we still kind of have to operate as if we do. Or maybe free will isn't what we think it is. Even if, yeah, I don't know. We'll have to pick this up after. Because this is like this is such a deep rabbit hole, and we will come back to it when we talk about mental causation. So, but I'm glad that you all are thinking about this. I'm going to try and finish off these last five slides now. Um, yeah, yeah, the selfish gene, like how your genes are selfish, but that means that the beings with those genes might behave altruistically, if I remember. It's been a long time since I've looked at that book. Um, okay. Yeah, I want to try and finish this because I'm getting a bit tired with this illness that has befallen me. But I think we can finish. I think we can finish on time. Um, part of the reason why is because I'm actually skipping some of this. So Kim, we're going to consider arguments against mind-brain identity now, but we're only really going to look at one. And that's the argument for multiple realization. Kim offers other arguments. There's the modal argument and the epistemological arguments. You can take a look at those if you want to. But I'm going to focus on multiple realization because, one thing I'm pretty certain about is that I am some sort of functionalist. And multiple realization is uh, is part of this functionalist way of understanding what the mental is. Okay, so Kim writes on page 121 that the psychoneural identity theory says that pain is C fiber excitation or stimulation. But that implies that unless an organism has C fibers, it cannot have pain. But aren't there pain capable organisms like reptiles and mollusks with nervous systems very different from the human nervous system? Yeah. There are animals with very different nervous systems than us, and we agree that they can feel pain. We mentioned this last time, right? The octopus, for example, has a much different nervous system than a human being. Very, very different. It has like little mini brains distributed throughout its body. Fascinating creatures, right? We could also conceive that there are perhaps aliens out there with radically different physiologies from us. And it seems a little bit absurd to deny that an alien with a very different physiology would be unable to experience pain on the basis of having a vastly different physiology, right? Yeah, they go blorp when they're in pain, and they don't have C fibers. They have like Zorg matrices or something. But they still experience pain, right? And we can understand that they experience pain because their pain terminology, their winces and groans and their blorps that co-occur with the activation of their Zorg matrices fixes the meaning of their pain terms, right? Um, so we wouldn't want to deny that these aliens are in pain just because they don't have C fibers, right? Maybe even we could build a robot and um, program it in such a way that it could experience pain. Maybe. I always think of that scene. Like, you guys ever watch the Star Wars movies, like the original, the trilogy, that came out in the 70s and 80s? So, yeah. Zorg matrices. Yeah, Liam's seen it. I tried to use some Star Wars as an example in my ethics of AI class last term, and almost no one had seen them. I was like, "What? What do you mean you guys haven't seen Star Wars?" But you know that scene where, Luke sends C-3PO and R2-D2 to Jabba the Hutt's palace on Tatooine, and he's given them away to Jabba the Hutt because the robots are kind of like slaves or second class citizens in Star Wars. So they're property. Luke Skywalker, he can just give them to Jabba the Hutt, and they're going to be fitted with their restraining bolts. And yeah, the droid torture room. And there's this poor little droid who's being flipped upside down and burned. Like, oh, I guess it's conceivable that a droid suitably constructed and programmed might be able to experience pain. It's conceivable, right? It also reminds me of that scene. There's an episode of The Simpsons. Yeah, Data and Lore. Data seems kind of phenomenally impoverished. I'm not so sure about Lore, right? But like Lore was a psychopath. He was too unstable. So so Dr. Noonien Soong had to make Data without emotions, right? But yeah, Data seems a little bit phenomenally impoverished, right? Um, that's from Star Trek, for those who are wondering. That's from Star Trek: The Next Generation, which is an excellent show, by the way. Um, but it also reminds me of that episode of The Simpsons. I think it's Lisa the Skeptic, where Lisa leads this archaeological dig and finds the skeleton of an angel, tries to get Stephen Jay Gould to conduct an analysis, and anyway, the town kind of riots and starts destroying museums and scientific institutions, and they set fire to the Springfield Robotics Institute, and so a robot runs out on fire screaming, "Why was I programmed to feel pain?" Um, it kind of reminds me of that. It's a bit of a silly example, but yeah, conceivably. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, Moriarty, well, that's interesting, right? Because so the reason why Moriarty program is so sophisticated is because I'm sorry if you already know this, Holly, but for people who might not be in the know, yeah, like Data created that version of Moriarty because he wanted an adversary that could beat him, right? So the enterprise computer creates an adversary that was worthy of Data, who is like so much more cognitively sophisticated than the average person because he's an android, right? But yeah, it's an example of free will. He wants to get out. Like, he knows he's a hologram and he wants to get out. Yeah, so good. Star Trek is great for philosophy. Like, seriously, everybody, if you haven't watched Star Trek, it's a great way to just like every episode is like like a little fun philosophy thought experiment. It's so good. Yeah, and he feels, yeah. Well, well, yeah, like what does he do? I think, therefore I am, right? Like he gets all Cartesian with it. Like I'd have to rewatch those episodes. They were good ones. Oh, nice. Oh, that must be Phil. Is that Phil Hoyek's class? Which episode did you guys watch? Yeah, I've been meaning to get to the Orville for a while. It's like a spirit, in many ways, a sort of spiritual successor to Star Trek: The Next Generation, from what I've heard. But yeah, I'm curious. Yeah, that's what I've heard. Yeah, I do want to give it a watch because I'm such a big Trekkie. But yeah, Leo, what was the episode that you watched? I'm curious because I've had some of my students watch some Star Trek in my ethics of AI class. I wonder if we're overlapping a bit. In my class, we watched The Measure of a Man, obviously, and then we followed that up with The Offspring. Ah, I knew it. Yeah, Measure of a Man. That's the one that every philosophy prof shows their students. But it's a good one. There's a good reason why we use that one. Um, and I think the Offspring complements it well. Quality of life too, but it's also a little bit cheesy because those exocomps are just like little guys hanging from a string. That is the one, yeah, where he's trying to legally establish his personhood. Yeah, such a good episode. Um, okay, yeah, sorry. Got a little off track there with or off track. Um, so sure, the long story short, yeah, we can conceive of robots with pain. So pain is multiply realizable. That's what we're saying. So identity statements like pain equals C fiber stimulation must be false, right? Like, okay, so like in Star Trek First Contact, where Data is kidnapped by the Borg Queen, and she starts like grafting skin on him and putting new chips in his head and stuff. Data becomes capable of feeling pain and pleasure. But Data doesn't have C fibers, he's an android. So this identity statement, pain equals C fiber stimulation, must be false. That's the multiple realizability argument. And this all has to do with a view called functionalism. That's what we're going to look at next time. But functionalism is due largely to Hilary Putnam, although Putnam is drawing very heavily on the work of Alan Turing. So for it's not our next lecture, but for Wednesday of next week, I've got one of Putnam's papers, and I also have one of Turing's papers, and I really think you guys would enjoy reading those. So I highly recommend the supplemental readings. But functionalism is one of the reasons why type physicalism went out of fashion. Um, on functionalism, mental states are functional states. So they're not identical with physical states, but mental states are realized by physical states, but they're not identical to them. Yeah, yeah, that could be true, but that's not type physicalism. That's token physicalism, or perhaps functionalism. So yeah, we don't want to deny that pain could not be Zorg matrices firing, right? So now what we need to open things up. We need to be less reductive. If we're going to be physicalists, we want to be non-reductive physicalists. Well, yeah, well, not exactly, because here we're identifying human pain with C fiber stimulation and alien pain with Zorg matrices, but we're not identifying these two actual phenomena with one another. These what we would call the physical implementations. We're not identifying those with one another. There are two different. Those would be two different types of realizers. we could call them. Um, so um, so these are again like token identity statements rather than type identity statements. Um, but well, yeah, I see what you're saying, Joshua. But why call that? Why not just call them both pain, right? Yeah, like pain equals equivalent pain realizers in various creatures. Yeah. Yeah, serving the same function but being different. Yeah. Well, that's the idea with non-reductive physicalism, right? Um, so again, type identity statements are too restrictive here. Type identity statement says that pain is a type of mental state that is C fiber stimulation, which means that if you don't have C fibers, you can't be in pain. But that's absurd. But maybe uh, each individual brain state, whether you have C fibers or not, whether you're an alien, an android, or a non-human animal, is a token of a type of brain state that's identical to being in pain. So you can identify, if you want to be an identity theorist, you can just abandon type physicalism and opt for token physicalism. And again, type physicalism is reductive, right? It reduces these kinds of mental states to kinds of physical states, eliminating the mental states. Token physicalism doesn't do that, right? Uh, and we see that in the examples that we've looked at. Ah, yes, Holly's getting it. That's good. Yeah. I like token physicalism. I like functionalism. I think I probably am a functionalist. So it's physicalism, but it's not reductive, right? Again, owing to the argument for multiple realizability. So, you can realize the mental state of being in pain with C fiber stimulation, with maybe suitable hardware and programming. If you're an alien with some kind of different physiology or with a non-human animal, right? There are lots of different ways to realize the state of being in pain, hence multiple realizability. And this is actually, as Kim says here on page 123, this is the most widely accepted form of physicalism that there is today. It combines substance physicalism with this sort of property dualism, right? As he says, all concrete individual things in this world are physical, but complex physical systems can and sometimes do exhibit properties that are not reducible to lower level physical properties. Among these irreducible properties are most notably psychological properties, including those investigated in the psychological and cognitive sciences. So chances are, if you go into a neuroscience department or a psychology department or cognitive science department, most of the people you talk to are going to be like functionalists or property dualists, right? Yeah, yeah, Holly can vouch. And as Paul says, yeah, token identity theory fits better with like functional neuroimaging stuff. Um, like I could like if you scan my brain and say Paul's brain at the same time, and then you poke our fingers, our brains aren't going to look exactly the same, in terms of the activity you're seeing there because we have different brains. Our brains are wired up a little differently because we're two different people with two different brains, but we're both in pain. When I taught cognitive science, right, I called this following Jose Luis Bermudez a sort of weak functionalism, and there's evidence like from neuroscience, uh, you know, when you look at non-human animals or just the differences in different people's brains or neuroplasticity as well. These are all evidence for functionalism. Okay, so one more. Yeah. Okay, so supervenience physicalists would say that the physical is fundamental, but there's a close and indispensable relationship between mental states and physical states. So remember supervenience, we talked about before how mental states supervene on physical states. Realization physicalists would say that mental states are non-reducible to the physical, but they're physically realized or implemented. So slight difference. But all non-reductive physicalists are also mental realists. That means they're realists about mental states. So mental states really exist. We don't reduce and eliminate them like we do with eliminative reductionism or type physicalism, right? Here are some claims of non-reductive physicalism. One claim is substance physicalism. Um, all that exists in the physical world is the physical, matter, energy, etc. Non-reductive physicalists, as the name implies, don't believe mental states are reducible to the physical. Um, we've got mind-body supervenience or realization, right? Either the mental properties supervene on the physical properties or they are realized by physical properties, and you endorse mental causal efficacy. So mental properties, you reject epiphenomenalism, essentially. Mental properties are causally efficacious, and mental events are sometimes the cause of other events. That event could be another mental event or a physical event. So, like one thought could cause another thought, or it could cause something physical, like the raising of your arm, something like that. All right, we made it. I'm surprised we went through this so quickly, given my state of having a cold. Um, are there any questions? Good question. I would say that you are still your mind. So you are your mind like you are your soul, but the mind is realized by the brain and is not reducible to the brain. Yeah, a thinking thing. Yeah, it's like I prepping and delivering this class is like taking the mind to the gym, I find, because it's an intense course. It's not mental gymnastics like in the sense of deceiving yourself, but it's like it is like a workout for the mind. Yeah. Um, okay, well, that's it. Next time, on Monday, I will deliver the instructions for the essay assignment and the final essay, the essay proposal assignment and the final essay assignment. And then we'll look at functionalism on Wednesday. Um, uh, I'm not sure. I'm not sure we're going to have time, Paul. But maybe if there is time, we can talk a bit about it. I would like to talk. I think it's pretty cool. I like the extended mind hypothesis. Um, Joshua says, might be an identity theorist. Yeah, functionalism. Yeah, I know what you mean. I think functionalism is the better option. Yeah. Maybe once, yeah, I think like you say, once you learn more about it, you might decide that that's what you are. So that's fair. Well, I'm gonna go try and rest and recover. Um, if you have any questions about anything, please send me a little email. Thanks, guys. Yeah, I'll try and feel better. I hope I feel better soon. Yeah. It's weird. It seems to be like really bad in the mornings and then gets better as the day goes on, and then I wake up the next day and feel terrible again. I don't know what the deal is there, but hopefully continue feeling better. Yeah. Yeah. So farewell, and I'll see you all on Monday. Bye.